The plan is to spray a material, possibly calcium carbonate, into the stratosphere to reflect some of the sun's radiation and to cool the planet. What could possibly go wrong? Well, since sensible people are considering doing it, we should probably have a look at that. None of this is new. What's described as geoengineering has long been a theoretical component of how humanity could respond to the problem of global warming. Generally, these sorts of approaches haven't been that high on the agenda because none of them were much advanced and because generally people had the same response, which is to ask, "Are you insane?" But we're now in a different world where governments are taking the issue of climate change a lot more seriously. And I mean seriously enough to adopt net zero carbon targets, which, even if you support them, as I do, is still a significantly disruptive and expensive programme. So it shouldn't be a surprise if they're looking more seriously at other courses of action, especially ones that might be effective on a shorter timescale and for a relatively low price. The thinking around this began particularly when Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines in 1991. That eruption injected around 20 million tonnes of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, which is the relatively stable layer that begins about 10 kilometres above the Earth's surface. Such material pushed into that layer can spread around the globe relatively evenly and stay there for about 2 years or more. The haze of sulfate particles from Mount Pinatubo was estimated to have cooled the planet by around 0.5 degrees Celsius, an effect that lasted for about 18 months. The thinking goes that if you could do that in a safe and organised way, then you could reduce temperatures during the coming decades to reduce short-term impacts while we work on removing carbon-based energy sources. They could use calcium carbonate, which light particles which would reflect a small percentage of the incoming solar radiation, and that would be enough to reduce the warming. It would hopefully be minimally intrusive while being highly effective. You would slow or halt the melting of the ice caps, you'd help halt heat stress being felt in some areas, you would hit the pause button on the whole thing. Well, most of it anyway. And it could be relatively low cost. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change estimated that a fleet of high-flying aircraft could offset 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming for up to 10 billion a year. Well, when you put it like that, what's not to like? A team at Harvard University have been working on this, a project called the Stratospheric Controlled Perturbation Experiment, thankfully shortened to SCoPEx. Their work is supported by a number of sponsors, with one significant one being Bill Gates. So far, their work has been restricted to computer models, trying to identify how such an intervention would be likely to play out. The first practical phase will take place, according to the plan, in June 2021, when the research balloon will take a test flight. It'll be a dry run of the steerable balloon and its instruments, not yet intended to add any material to the atmosphere. Even that step won't take place until it's been approved by an independent advisory board that's been set up by the company for the purpose. Which is a bit weird. If all you're doing is flying a balloon, why would you need to? But it reflects the awareness of the team of the extraordinary sensitivity of the project's concept when it comes to public opinion. The next step after that, at a date currently unspecified, would be to undertake the flight, release a small amount of calcium carbonate, and then observe its effects. The quantities will be tiny, a fraction of what a single airplane would release in a flight. But the point is that if it's calcium carbonate that's to be used, it's not a substance that naturally exists in the stratosphere. You need to know in some detail how it will behave before any project to release it in quantity. You might say, well, if you have to do this, and we'll come back to that question later, if you have to do this, why not release the same sulfur dioxide that Mount Pinatubo did, since we already know how that behaves? And that is a possibility for exactly that reason. However, one of the things that we do know is that sulfur dioxide can have an impact on stratospheric ozone, which shields the Earth from harmful UV rays from the sun. Even if in the quantities that we're talking about it wouldn't be catastrophic, we'd probably prefer if the material that was used was more benign. Calcium carbonate is believed to be such a material. It will absorb less heat than sulfates and have less impact, if any, on the ozone layer. But you have to test that assumption with real-world experimentation at some points, because in the worst-case scenario, this could go horribly wrong. Global warming doesn't just gently warm the globe, it results in hard-to-predict more extreme events in various places, and so we should expect would artificially induced cooling. If it went wrong, you could envisage parts of the world finding shifting rain patterns, robbing crops of sunlight and so on. Alan Robock of Rutgers University has put together a list of 27 possible risks from this sort of geoengineering, covering both environmental and human impacts. Everything from disrupted monsoons to reduced solar power generation and crop reduction. A study published in 2018 showed that the Mount Pinatubo eruption, as well as the El Chichon eruption in Mexico in 1982, resulted in reduced yields in maize, soya, rice and wheat. In some parts of the world, you might boost agricultural production by reducing heat stress, but it's entirely possible that any benefit would be offset or even outweighed by those negatives. All the more reason, say the researchers, for us to do the work now to find out what the effects would be likely to be. Because one of the fears are that governments might one day panic over the consequences of global warming. Suppose there's a particularly severe, widespread weather event, and they could jump into such a programme without having done the necessary careful work to get it right. And you have to bear in mind, the cost of doing this is relatively cheap. Cheap enough that actually a maverick national leader or even a sufficiently wealthy businessman could simply decide to go it alone. Suppose someone had persuaded Donald Trump that this was the way to cheaply tackle global warming while still keeping coal. Would he have waited for the United Nations to give him permission? What do you think? Or what about China? It has the incentive, having a more vulnerable agriculture than most, with the smallest amount of agricultural land per head of any equivalent nation. Plus, it wants to develop and is currently kicking out lots of carbon. Plus, it has an authoritarian dictatorship. Historically, a form of government prone to isolationism on the one hand and grandiosity in equal measure. Suppose China just decided to do it. Would the world go to war with a nuclear power nonetheless to stop them from doing it? Or would they negotiate a compromise? What would that look like? Something like the Iran nuclear deal, perhaps. Sort of sloppy compromise that promises things that doesn't actually ultimately stop them from doing exactly what they wanted in the first place. So the argument goes, the more work you've done, the less likely you'll be in a position where this gets done to you badly and at enormous cost. Of course, others simply point to that and say, every step you take leads to the next step. And, that's true. The more people believe it's inevitable, the more it will become so. It highlights the challenges to come because there is no global governance in this area. No agreements between nations on common understandings of what can and cannot be done. In the absence of that, the initiative could well be taken without oversight. Just consider the fact that Elon Musk has, in the last couple of years, launched thousands of mini satellites. Suddenly you had astronomers reporting that the web of reflective satellites was seriously interfering with night sky visibility, which would potentially hamper their serious work. Who owns the sky? Who gets to decide what can and can't be put into it? The answer right now is no one and anyone. If you do something that creates real harm, then there could be legal recourse. But does the slight dimming of the atmosphere constitute harm, especially if it weighed against beneficial consequences? What if it does indeed go wrong and rain patterns are interrupted and a significant part of Africa or Asia got thrown into drought? What sort of remedy would be available to the countries affected? Or more to the point, supposing you do this and a country gets thrown into drought, how do you prove that was definitely the result of the solar dimming and wouldn't have happened anyway? As people often say, the climate's always changing. But we've persuaded ourselves in the last few decades that every major event must be caused by humans, which some of them may be, but many are not, including many of the most damaging ones. How much more would that tendency come to the fore if we'd done something as directly interventionist as this solar dimming project? You can see how that would play out in the most enormous blame game. Now, right now, most people seem to be instinctively against this sort of intervention, including the people who you'd probably think should be for it. I mean, if you're one of the extreme environmentalists who says that the children of today will die from climate change and not from old age, a claim which isn't supported by the mainstream science, remember, then in theory you would have to consider this. I mean, seriously, if you believed your own rhetoric, how could you not? How could you not be willing to take the relatively small risk if you genuinely believed that billions might die in the relatively short term because of climate change? Now, so far, they've rejected out of hand like they do any other technical innovation, which seems to be, I mean, I'm not a mind reader, but it seems to be because it's really about promoting changing political systems and individual lifestyles more than it is really about climate change. I'm not saying they rationalise that in that way to themselves, but it does seem to be the logic of the position. Now, you'd also think the climate change skeptics would be quick to jump on this as well. Of course, they'd argue you could do this for a longer period of time, so humanity could finish off working its way through all the fossil fuels and working on proper carbon capture technologies. Those that are motivated by a defence of the status quo could find a lot to like about a scheme that puts off the need for radical change and doesn't cost much. Now, it's not really a viable argument because it eases short-term symptoms without tackling the long-term causes. So the underlying rate of warming from increasing rates of CO2 would continue to rise, meaning that if at any point in the future you stopped dimming the sun, then you'd be hit by an even larger short-term hit. And it's something that you could only really justify as a short-term delaying tactic to preserve natural systems that might be at risk while you took action to tackle the causes. And many would say you shouldn't take that risk until you can see you really have little choice, because some big impacts are making themselves felt outside the world of computer modelling. It's something that's going to sort out the catastrophic sheep from the merely inconvenient goats. I've never personally understood why the rise of sea levels by a metre or two gets described as catastrophic by some. I mean, it would force significant adaptations for sure. It would give various cities big problems to overcome. I mean, huge problems. But the climate changes we've seen in the past have done that periodically. And that's not to say that we should happily do it to ourselves, because it doesn't matter. The effects get more severe the warmer we go. The more we can do, the better. But if you're not prepared to consider this sort of measure, if it would be the only way short term to prevent those sea level rises, then presumably you also don't think that they're catastrophic. Catastrophic situations justify radical action, don't they? There are other proposals in geoengineering that people might conclude would be a safer bet. For instance, the proposal to put up large mirrors in orbit to reflect some of the sunlight away, or seeding clouds to make them brighter and more reflective. These could be more expensive, but would have the benefit that you would be doing nothing that couldn't be quickly reversed, and nothing that actually affects the chemical composition of the atmosphere. And for that reason, you might actually get the buy-in from the world community for it to be done. Because when push comes to shove, the intuitive reaction to this proposal is so commonly overwhelmingly negative. The fear of consequences so natural and intuitive and kind of rational. I simply don't believe this project would ever be granted approval by that world community. Not in this modern era where societies have become so risk averse. Janos Pastor of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative put it like this: If you make use of this technology and do it badly or ungoverned, then you can have different kinds of global risk created that can have equal, if not even bigger challenges to global society than climate change. In other words, the cure could be worse than the disease. And that's something we've been hearing a lot about lately. It'll only happen because A, something happens to create panic and overreaction, or B, a maverick nation or wealthy group decide to take responsibility upon themselves without agreement. The scientists such as SCoPEx's David Keith argue that evenly seeding the entire atmosphere with low levels of reflective dust should be a far lower risk of unexpected problems than people fear. And you know what? I have no doubt he's right. I'm sure that if done carefully, this would actually work in the way that they imagine that it would. But it doesn't matter. So far, scientists generally have proven time and time again their inability to take wider audiences with them. One study envisages a slow 15-year preparation for deployment, allowing time for global consensus on government, say with a United Nations resolution, and for cross-border scientific cooperation to foster partnerships. But that will just give opponents a lot more time to stir up opposition. And just imagine all the different flavours of conspiracies that this would spawn. And particularly now, when there's something of a growing backlash against technocratic elites, the distrust many now have in having our world governed by technocrats, I just don't think that's going away in the short term. Most likely, the research will be done, and if it is shown it can be done safely, it'll be kept on reserve for when and if things start to move faster than they are. And I think that's fine. A sort of insurance policy, a last-ditch intervention only to be used if things have gotten significantly worse than we expect. That's my starting position. But I'm open to arguments. What are your thoughts? Should a project like this go ahead if it can be shown to be safe? Or is it exactly the sort of messing with the planet we should be doing less of? Let me know what you think in the comments below.